Gather round the fire, my friends, for I've a chilling tale that will curdle your blood and make your skin crawl. A story of a monster that lurked in the Australian outback, preying on innocent souls who dared to venture through his hunting grounds. Our nightmarish story starts back in 1990, when a young Brit named Paul Onions was backpacking across the vast lands down under. He was hoping to hitchhike from city to city to save his money for exploring all of Australia's natural wonders. Little did Paul know, he would soon come face to face with the living embodiment of evil itself. It began when Paul stuck out his thumb by the side of the road. A white Toyota Land Cruiser pulled up and the driver offered Paul a ride. The man introduced himself as Bill and seemed friendly enough, so Paul hopped in. As they drove through the remote bushland, the mood strangely shifted. Bill started asking Paul discomforting questions. Did anyone know where he was headed? Did he have special forces training? The hairs on Paul's neck stood up as they turned down an isolated dirt road. His heartbeat quickened when Bill stopped the car near an ominous-looking forest trail, claiming he needed to grab a cassette tape from the back. But instead of music, Bill pulled out a gun and rope, yelling, "This is a robbery." Fear jolted through Paul's body. Without thinking, he burst from the car and sprinted down the road, Bill's shouts echoing behind him. By sheer luck, Paul managed to flag down another car. The driver rushed Paul to the authorities. Paul's terrifying tale spread through backpacking circles, warning of a robber haunting Australia's highways. Most assumed he had narrowly escaped becoming another statistic, just one creep preying on wandering youths. If only it had ended there. This was no ordinary thief. As the months went by, a darker and more sinister mystery began swirling through the Australian outback. Joanne Walters and Carolyn Clark were two young British travelers who had become fast friends exploring Australia's wild beauty. Their glowingly written postcards told of golden beaches, diving the Great Barrier Reef, nights spent stargazing in the bush. But suddenly, the postcards' home stopped. Calls from their families to hostels and travel companies turned up nothing. The girls had simply vanished into the hot Australian wind without a trace. Missing flyers plastered every tourist kiosk, but weeks melted into months with no sign of Joanne or Carolyn. Then came a ghastly discovery. Their decomposed bodies found dumped in Belanglo State Forest, gagged, stabbed through the heart, spines gruesomely cut. A serial killer was on the loose, but the girls were just the beginning. More vanishings followed, backpackers embarking on their Australian adventures only to disappear forever into the unforgiving outback. Distraught families overseas pleading for answers, while Australian authorities dragged their feet. Until the Belanglo State Forest bore more fruit, 7 mutilated bodies in total unearthed from the shadows. A serial killer monster was stalking Australia's tourist trails, slaughtering starry-eyed wanderers. Fear rippled through youth hostels as everyone wondered who would be next. And could the villain already be riding beside them as they hitched to their next destination? Little did the public know, the clues to unraveling this mystery had already surfaced once before. If only the authorities had listened closer to Paul Onion's shocking roadside tale years earlier, perhaps some wanderers could have been spared their horrifying fates. Paul's attacker was no mere thief. Behind his facade lurked the man whose crimes inspired the film Wolf Creek, Ivan Milat, the backpacker murderer, a sadistic hunter who saw fresh young travelers as ideal prey for his twisted games. The Belanglo Butcher, as he came to be called, inflicted unimaginable pain and suffering upon his victims before burying them out in the deadly Australian bush. By the time his 7 known victims were found dumped in the bowels of Belanglo State Forest, the killer's brutal signature was clear. Young wanderers making their way across Australia's vast highways, only to disappear forever once they accepted rides from a friendly face. Each ultimately ending up gagged and bound, gruesomely stabbed and shot, their mutilated corpses turning up miles away, callously discarded under the towering eucalyptus trees lining the forest's narrow dirt logging roads. With global headlines screaming about a serial killer monster stalking the Australian outback, examining the lives of Ivan Milat's hapless victims offers the deepest glimpse into his psychopathic mind. Take young couple Deborah Everest and James Gibson, blissfully in love, lifelong activists who often protested against the logging companies damaging Australia's precious wildlands. Last seen cheerful and carefree, singing campfire songs with friends before departing to hike through the Grand National Parks, cameras in hand. Authorities believe the romantic pair were lured into Ivan Milat's clutches under the guise of seeking a ride to one of these dazzling protected nature sites. Based on how decomposition affected their bodies, it's presumed Ivan kept Deborah and James alive for nearly a week after abducting them, holding his prisoners hostage while carrying out prolonged, agonizing assaults. Another young hitchhiker, Simone Schmiedel from Germany, was backpacking solo across Australia's cities before reporting to family her plans of camping under starlit skies. Instead, her bright future was choked out by strangling wires found curled around her corpse. Another German, Anja Habscheid, met a similar sinister fate. Beloved daughter and sister embarking on a trip of a lifetime down under with her devoted boyfriend Gabor. Yet they too accepted a ride from the wrong stranger. Ivan Milat's great talent was disguising himself as a friendly local Aussie, just offering a helping hand. Tourists found his charismatic hospitality comforting so far from home. And tragically, by the time they uncovered his true malignant intentions, there was no escape from Ivan's soundproof torture chamber hidden deep in the bushland. Based on scattered evidence, officials deciphered victims were chained inside this killer's private prison for days on end, their tortured screams muffled as he carried out gratuitous rituals, binding them wrist to ankle with elaborate knots. When he finished toying with them like playthings, Ivan ended his captives' misery with a final rain of bullets, forever silencing their voices before dumping their broken bodies out in the brush, leaving behind cigarette butts and shell casings as signatures of his atrocities. Authorities discovered 7 victims brutally slain by Ivan's hands, but chilling accounts suggest while imprisoned, the sadist secretly boasted to family members of many more than 7, too many to possibly recall. Sharp listeners may recall the odd name Paul Onions mentioned way back at our story's start, the terrified British traveler who narrowly escaped becoming another Belanglo victim after Ivan tried robbing and kidnapping him. Due to bleak Australian statistics of countless travelers disappearing every year, Paul's chilling encounter failed to raise enough initial alarm, until, over 4 excruciating years later, detectives finally connected the dots, realizing Paul had crossed paths with the vanquishing backpacker murderer himself. Paul's was the testimony needed to publicly link Ivan Milat to the serial slayings. Australia's most wanted found himself handcuffed and on trial for 7 counts of murder, confronted by damning evidence from extensive searches of the Milat family's isolated forest properties. From the victims' missing backpacks and cameras, all the way down to sleeping bags, water bottles, and travel diaries, Milat kept everything as ghoulish trophies while leaving his prisoners' corpses callously dumped outside his back porch. Caught red-handed despite sticking stubbornly to his claims of innocence, Ivan Milat was ultimately brought to justice through historic sentencing to life behind bars without parole. Visitors exploring Belanglo Forest today may happen across a simple trailside plaque memorializing the 7 known victims of Ivan Milat's sadistic slaughtering spree. Milat passed away behind bars several years ago, stubbornly taking his full body count to the grave. leaving anguished families around the world forever wondering whether their missing daughter's remains continue decaying out in the rugged Australian wilderness. Undiscovered ghosts whose voices were permanently silenced by the merciless bushland butcher.